Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Technical video, we're going to be discussing Assassin's Creed 4, primarily the technology. And the great news is the PC version is shaping up to be pretty damn impressive. The team behind AC4, of course Ubisoft, Ubisoft Montreal to be precise, has been discussing many things in a recent interview. And indeed it will not only be using DX11.2, it will also support AMD's new API, Mantle. And so this is going to lead to a very good looking version of the game, and more to the point as well, much better performance from the previous versions which have been on PC, and they haven't really performed maybe quite as well as what we expected. So the question was asked how AC4's Black Flag will be powered by the Anvil Next engine, and they were asked what the difference is between the Anvil Next engine and the version of the engine that was used to power AC3. The biggest difference, is obviously in quote, is that Anvil Next supports the current generation PS3 and Xbox 360 and the next generation PC, PS4 and Xbox One of consoles. We modified the engine to add support for per-generation assets. It's now possible, for example, for an artist to provide a more detailed mesh, out of quote just for a second, that would of course be for characters or for the basic geometry which makes up a level. The higher detailed mesh equals more smooth shapes, or the more detail that you can manage to fit in and make the model look better. Back into quote, a more detailed mesh for the next generation version and less detailed for the current generation. The same thing can be done with particle emitters, special effects, etc. We improved Anvil Next lighting and atmospheric effects. We started rewriting a large portion of our lighting system to support dynamic global illumination. Then we implemented a physically based volumetric fog that reacts to local lights. We added a new 3D rain system that renders each raindrop individually using thousands of lit particles that can collide with the environment. This rain system also generates dynamic ripples that can react to the wind. We've also added new features for the Anvil like motion blur, support for 3D foliage, God rays, translucency, and screen space reflection. And finally, we upgraded some existing features like depth of field and the particle renderer. End quote for just a moment. That's actually a pretty damn impressive list. Even things such as 3D foliage, which may sound like, oh okay, that's a nice thing to have. I don't know if you've ever played a game and you've been looking down at the floor, and as you're walking past, say, blades of grass, and if you go to a certain different angle, you can just basically see that they look pretty ugly. They are pretty much completely and utterly flat and two-dimensional. They have very little life, even if they happen to be animated. And things such as very good 3D foliage, things such as, say, oh I don't know, wind affecting, say, oh I don't know, puddles of water. It has huge impacts to the immersion of the environment. It's not just a case of you walking through a puddle of water and your, footsteps creating ripples. It should also be that rain falling on the water actually affects how the puddle is formed and how it actually moves. And when you think about it, if you just go outside when it's raining and you look at, say, how just even a windy day affects a puddle of water, it's quite impressive. And this has been something that I've been saying for a long time now about just how physics and gaming technology is starting to become a lot more advanced in these areas. Now, it's no secret that Assassin's Creed 3 and below weren't exactly super optimized for PC. Even titles like Splinter Cell Conviction and AC3, for example, you pretty much had no luck if you had more than 3 CPU cores. That's not to say the game would crash or not run, but it simply would just ignore them. In other words, you could have 1,000 CPU cores. Of course, I'm being a bit silly, but you could have 1,000 and it would just play on the first 3. And that really wasn't great news for titles that were running on AMD hardware, because AMD hardware typically goes the more higher core route, but those cores are slightly less powerful in terms of IPC, instructions per clock. And basically Ubisoft are wanting to tackle that. There was a major optimization pass that was done on the engine, not just for PC, but for every platform. The scheduler used for rendering has been rewritten from the ground up. In AC4, the engine will use all cores it needs until it sees that using more cores brings no more gain. So yes, we should expect better performance on PC than AC3, especially on DX11 hardware. So how does the next generation titles, or next generation version of AC4, in other words, on the PlayStation 4, for example, stack up to the PC? Because I'm sure that's going to be a question that many of you are going to ask. And so it was asked, how does the PC version stack up to the next gen? And will we expect any PC exclusive features that won't be present in next generation? And obviously things such as DX11 do not count. The team answered all of the next gen features will be available on PC. On top of that, there will be a team at Ubisoft Kiev which worked on several PC specific features. These are improved HBAO, and this, by the way, stands for Horizon Based Ambient Occlusion. MSAA, which of course is an advanced anti-aliasing technique, which is pretty damn helpful. Contact hardened soft shadows and improved God rays. The UI has also been updated on the PC version. Also, the video card owners will have access to the TXAA, but also the GeForce Experience graphics option will automatically adjusted in accordance to the user's GPU, and as usual, PC versions will be scalable. So if you're using an older GPU, you'll be able to disable some of the features. And what are the key features on the other piece of technology, I hear you cry? Well, the title will also support tessellation. And they were asked, have you experimented with it, adaptive tessellation, in order to eliminate the pop in and out of distant objects? We worked on tessellation for a while, especially on the ocean, and in the end, the team did a great job of the look and feel and performance of the ocean, that adding tessellation did not bring anything more to the game, so we decided not to use it. This allowed us to have a single rendering technique for the ocean across all platforms. The only place where tessellation is used is to improve the God rays on the PC. By the way, just in case you're wondering what God rays are, they're basically very bright shafts of light which come down from, say, where the sun is supposed to be. It's basically another form of lighting, just to kind of get us all on the same page there. Now, what about the global illumination? Our global illumination is based on previous work that was done internally at Ubisoft, deferred radiance transfer volumes, but we improved it greatly. Using a nav mesh, we automatically populate our world with thousands of probes. For each probe, we then compute the radiance of a different time of the day. Those computations are done on the build machine GPU, so they're really fast. We can compute thousands of probes per minute. At runtime, on the player machine, we will then interpolate the data to get the proper bounce lighting for any time of the given day, world position and weather. The bounce sun lighting is then combined with ambient occlusion and sky lighting to achieve a full indirect and global illumination solution. The system works on both current and next gen systems. So techniques such as ambient occlusion are actually, and this is out of quote, but techniques like ambient occlusion are extremely important. They help to basically simulate how light works, and this is especially true because lighting is incredibly complicated in real life. In real life, you don't really think about it. But in video games, it's actually kind of a nightmare. There are so many different surfaces, and those surfaces aren't just a case of, well, they reflect or they don't reflect. It's also a combination of how much light do they reflect, what happens to the rays of light as they are reflected. Just to give you an example of this, certain materials may reflect light and scatter the light. Other materials will just suck all the light up. Others may scatter it more. Others may just put it in a certain direction. Others may say, let certain amounts of light through to one side of the room, but let's say it's kind of like, I don't know, a piece of glass. It might let some light in, but might reflect some light as well. So in other words, it's kind of bouncing light out. So let's assume that you're looking at a house. Well, if you're looking at it from the outside, you can see the sun reflecting out, but in reality, it's also coming in as well. And so there are so many different calculations the game has to run to actually make it look good. And that's why lighting can sometimes look still kind of off. I don't know if you've ever played a game and surfaces can look a bit too shiny in some cases, like there's too much light. That was a really big problem on the previous generation. I'm talking like early PS3/Xbox 360 and late PS2. There was a hell of a lot of light, and it looked better, but certain surfaces just looked a bit too shiny. And of course, some of it was down to the materials themselves, but it was to do with the way that the way the lighting was actually interacting with those surfaces. And sometimes it just wasn't diffused enough. Other times it was just too, how can I put this? It was just too pinpoint. It looked like sometimes like it was under a spotlight, which isn't exactly natural in many different situations. Of course, AC4 will be completely and utterly playable at 1080p at 60 frames a second without too much big deal. In fact, a fairly modest system, such as a Phenom 2 X4, which is a very cheap processor, might I add. I'm not exactly sure what that would be in dollars, but you're probably looking at maybe about $70 to $80, depending on how much you do shopping around. A rather minuscule 4 gigs of RAM, which considering most PCs now have at least double that. A fairly reasonable GPU, GTX 470 or Radeon HD 5850. Once again, not a particularly high-spec card. This is actually the recommended configuration with 1 GB of memory. And that will apparently, according to the developers, be playing the game at least 1080p 30 frames per second with everything on max. And if you've got a high-end system with a modern-day GPU, you're going to easily be able to turn on all the effects with 60 frames per second at 1080p. No problems at all. And of course, you're also going to get the better effects than even the next generation consoles are capable of, according to the developers. Another big question. Let's discuss DX11.2 and Windows 8. So, what do they think, and will they natively support 64-bit operating systems only? I think that some of the features on DX11.2 will make our life easier. For example, a unified way to use tiled resources would be welcome. Tiled resources, by the way, of course, are a memory texturing technique which basically, as you're getting closer to an object, swaps a lower resolution version of that tile or that particular texture for a higher definition one, so that you save a lot of memory resources, allowing us to focus on other aspects of the game. It's a nice incremental upgrade to DX11. On AC4 we did not have time to investigate DX11.2, but we made sure it was running correctly on Windows 8. To be able to reach as many fans as possible, we decided to still use 32-bit executable, but yes, it's only a question of time before we switch completely to 64-bit executable. Out of quote, I don't think that's going to be too long at all, to be honest with you. You've got to remember that the next generation systems, the PS4 and Xbox One, are both using x86/64-bit CPUs, and despite, yes, the fact that not all of the memory, not all of the 8 gigs is going to be available for games, more than 4 gigs is. And of course, the problem with a 32-bit executable is it's just not really able to address more than 4 gigs of RAM. It's kind of like a hard limit. and so it just doesn't make sense for them to hamstring themselves in the future. Now obviously there's also the Mantle. Now I have got a video currently about Mantle, so you can check that out if you're curious, but suffice to say it's a low level API. One of the problems with say DirectX 11 or OpenGL, which of course are other graphic solutions, graphic APIs, is that they rely on high-level access. In other words, they don't necessarily have a good ratio because there's very high overhead for, say, for the CPU, and you don't get access to all the GPU features. AMD are producing a Mantle, which gives you a lot of access to these GPU features for GCN architectures. And so they were asked, Ubisoft, what do you think of that? And what do you think of it? I'm sorry, and what do you what do you think its future is? And they replied, on one hand, we're very excited by the Mantle. Since we use low-level API because of our work on consoles, it's not something we're afraid of. We are confident that we could use it to deliver a significant performance boost to our games. On the other hand, we're a little wary of it, because it would mean another renderer to maintain. The more renderers we have, the more we have to split our time between each of them, and the less time we have to improve visual effects and performance of our games. So it's really a double-edged sword. We'll have to analyze the pros and cons before we take that decision. End quote. This has been another concern, of course, with the Mantle. I did highlight that in the original video. The problem is, it's very much like the original Glide API, which of course was utilized by Voodoo back in the day, and honestly speaking it can be really great, but it can also be a bit of a pain in the ass just because of that. So we'll have to see, I suppose, just what level of parity DX11, OpenGL, Mantle and all the others managed to kind of settle into with the gaming industry. There's still a lot of different points of view right now. Let's just go with that. However, many would agree, purely from the performance perspective, it could be a very good thing. So there you have it, guys. That's the interview. That's on DSO Gaming, by the way, so you can check that out. My personal opinion with this is that I actually really like the fact that they're improving the version for the PC. Obviously, it's going to require a fairly beefy GPU, but at least it gives us the option. You know what? To be fair, Ubisoft are actually pretty good with PC ports, but it's becoming less of a port now. In fact, obviously, they're going to be using pretty much exactly the same version for the PC, just with most likely better looking lighting and so on, which obviously the GPU of the PC is able to offer, but who knows what the future holds. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'm going to get going, so I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.